Jimmy, are you ready? Bill 13? Or I'm sorry, that's Senator Thomas. Are you ready? The Guam legislature is back in session. We're in second reading. The first bill on the agenda is Bill 13-34. Senator Ada, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 13-34, COR, as corrected by the prime sponsor and amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform into the third reading file, and I'd like to discuss it.
You're recognized. Any objection? No.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we had actually began to discuss Bill 13 about 2 sessions ago, and we had received a letter of objection from the Barrigada mayor asking that it be returned back to committee. At that time, we did return it back to committee, and since then, we're pulling it back out because the mayor did submit she submitted her letter of concern on March 30th, and on August 30th, she withdrew. She sent a letter to the Secretary of the Legislature asking, indicating that she has withdrawn her concerns and that the concerns have been addressed. So that's why, so I decided to put it back, asked to put it back on the agenda. Mr. Speaker, Bill 13, basically some of the background on it is that the U.S. Congress in 1990 enacted the Defense Base Realignment and Closure Act, otherwise known as BRAC 1990. This act set the stage for the return of lands in South Quezon, an area that for decades had been used to support the activities of the military-industrial complex. Passed around right now is an aerial of photos of the area that we're talking about, consisting of 3 pages. Page 1 basically is just a real 1/50,000. It shows there a triangular shape in yellow in relation to where the runway is for the airport. On page 2 of that graphic, it's just a closer shot. To the left is Barrigada Village. To the right is the airport's airfield. And then on page 3, it shows more of the landmarks that can be used for to orient everyone. So to the left of the graphic is Route 8. Towards the right, you'll see Route 10 or Route 16. There's an indication there of where the post office is. And then the 2 heavy white lines that you see, the one that goes north-south, that's Mariner Avenue. That's the one that runs right along Quezon High School, right by EPA. And the other one that runs more of a east-west is Corsair Avenue. And Corsair Avenue connects with the tri-intersection, Route 10, Route 8, Route 16. Mariner Avenue actually runs behind the post office and connects to Route 10, and on the north side there is Route 8. And these are actually rights of way that have been surveyed when they were returned by the military, and it was intended as a bypass road between these 2 main highways, as well as Corsair. The area consists, this South Quezon, the area that's shown, that's enclosed here, consists of approximately 248 acres and is spread out over 40 lots. Return of the land by the federal government to Gov Guam was contingent upon the requirement that a land use master plan be developed, with a proviso that use of the property be limited to industrial and commercial activities. The Tizan Land Use Master Plan was approved by the federal government in 1996, and the land, that 248 acres, 40 lots, was ultimately returned to the original landowners in 2002. So what exactly does Bill 13 do? When these properties were returned, it was returned and it immediately automatically assumed the zoning of agriculture A, and that allows the land users then to be able to rezone their properties up to whatever they are able to justify. But in view of the fact that the land use master plan has been approved to basically enable the industrial and commercial use of the South Tizan property, what Bill 13 does is it proposes to allow landowners the opportunity to come in and opt in if they want to upgrade the zoning of their properties from A to M1. So Bill 13 requires land management to notify all the affected landowners of this opportunity to rezone their properties. It also allows landowners 90 days to come in and voluntarily opt in to rezone their properties. They have to come in and in writing say, yes, I want to rezone my property, or if they don't come in, then it basically, the zoning remains as agriculture. A zone remains intact if the landowner wishes to retain status quo. However, subsequent rezoning will process pursuant to the zoning law. Then you submit your application packet to the Department of Land Management. It goes through the Guam Land Use Commission. The rezoning application gets reviewed by the Application Review Committee, which comprised of the various permitting agencies, GWA, EPA, DPW. The landowner who opts to rezone their property must pay a fee of $640 to defray the costs that land management will incur in this process, sending out notices and other administrative paperwork that would be involved. Now, there were concerns that was raised when the Bill 13 was introduced, in particular by the Barrigada mayor. One concern that she had was that there was connector roads needed in and out of Tizan, because right now there's really actually only one access into and out of Tizan, and that's not even a legal access. That goes through private property. So if that property owner decides to close it today, access will become a problem. So as you can see on that page 3 of the handouts that were given, you have Mariner Avenue and Corsair Avenue, and that will address that particular concern insofar as getting connector road systems in place. Communications letters have been sent to Department of Public Works requesting that they act on this to connect Mariner Avenue to Route 8 and Route 16. The other concern that the mayor had was the issue about infrastructure. Was there enough infrastructure to provide the utility services into that area? And of course, the GPA and GWA did provide their input and indicated that there was sufficient infrastructure in there to support the current demand. However, not knowing what kind of development is going to take place, as those developments take place, then we'll know what kind of expansion will be needed. The other concern that the mayor had was the impact to the inventory of agricultural land. Well, the area hasn't been used in the past, since the Navy had it, hasn't been used for agricultural activities. And we did get an agricultural impact statement from the Department of Agriculture, indicating that really the inventory of agricultural land is not affected by the rezoning of South Teason, because it has not been used as an for agricultural activities. The other question that the mayor had was, who are the affected landowners? Well, the Department of Land Management, in their testimony, they came in and they have identified who the affected landowners are, and it is these people that they will send notification to. Of course, this is like a moving target, because as soon as the opportunity becomes available to be able to maybe sell, then, or if after a probate, the land gets distributed out, then now you have not just one landowner, but you have many. And finally, the mayor had concerns about unexploded ordinances in the area. And of course, prior to development, landowners do need to ensure that there's no unexploded ordinances. Notwithstanding, then, on August 30th, the mayor did write to the Secretary of the Legislature and indicated that she has withdrawn her concerns. I think that the support for Bill 13 can probably best be stated by a landowner, former Judge Stephen Ampinco. And he says, "It is just, fair, and reasonable for lawmakers to facilitate and assist Teason landowners in developing their property after decades of deprivation of the opportunity to own, possess, and make use of the land." So, and that's basically what Bill 13 does, is instead of having these 40 landowners take a number, line up at Guam Land Use Commission to basically apply for a zoning status that really already it's industrial for all intents and purposes, the legislature is doing it legislatively. Land Management, in their testimony, they said they support Bill 13-34. Department of Agriculture similarly had no concerns regarding the bill. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask my colleagues to favorably consider Bill 13 so that then we can start getting these lands moved to their best and highest use. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the motion? On the motion. Any senator wish to be heard on the motion? If not, all right. Senator Espaldon, then Senator Terlai.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the author of this bill for allowing me to co-sponsor this bill with him. And through this process, if we all note the number of this is bill number 13-34. This bill was one of the first 13 bills to be introduced in this legislature. We are now really in, if you take a look at the bills now, we're, I think, in bills in the hundreds. But, so this is early on, and I do appreciate the sponsor of this bill really taking his time in trying to resolve a lot of the issues that others have raised, and especially that of the Barrigada Mayor and her Municipal Planning Council. And so this has gone through several steps just to make sure that most, if not all, of the concerns relative to this piece of legislation were addressed and looked into, and the good author spoke to them previously. The reason why, and I won't reiterate or try to repeat anything else, but the reason why I support this bill is because when you start talking about the designation of these properties as envisioned to be used for economic development, in particular for industrial and business parks, this is actually a good site. Because one of the things that came to my mind when the author approached me on this was that right now we have very limited amount of M1 light industrial zone property on this island, in which you can put up the warehouses and manufacturing facilities and whatnot. And so when you start talking in terms of where is most of the M1 property is down in Harmon. And we all know the congestion that's happening there right now. Anybody who is going to work in those, in that industry, in the industries down in Harmon, whether they be from Maritzo or Jigo, Barrigada, Mangilaw, they all drive towards this area. This bill really will allow the landowners to perhaps develop their properties for an industrial park, which would then really disperse the congestion that we now see happening because most of the industrial zone is in Harmon. This will allow those people who might be from the central area, Barrigada, Mangilaw, maybe in Jonia and all the way down south, to maybe access employment closer to home. On top of it, this also will allow for the development of industrial type companies in which we can see economic growth, in which people can have employment, in which we can perhaps broaden our economic base. And to me, that was the real attraction here. Once we got through all the hurdles of addressing all the concerns and all the complaints that came with this bill, I think it's ripe to go ahead and address it right now and to accept it. Because what we do want to see is more economic activity on Guam. That's not limited to Harmon when it comes to the industrial zone type of industries. But we want to be able to spread it so access to our various villages, members of our various villages, don't have to travel so far and have to basically funnel into Harmon just to get to work. So I fully support this measure, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that our colleagues will definitely give it favorable consideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're being asked today to rezone 40 lots in Tiden, a total of 250 acres, from A to M1. And this is a very significant jump in zoning, if I could call it that. You know, there are different zones in between agriculture and M1. M1 is one of the highest zonings available. M1, which means industrial use, includes, allows a property to be used for all purposes that a commercial property could be used for, and in addition, for manufacturing, compounding, processing or treating products such as drugs, cosmetics, and food products, the manufacturing, compounding, assembling, treating articles or merchandise from previously prepared materials, automobile repair shops, truck and tractor repair, bottling and packaging plants, ceramic products manufacturing, laundries and cleaning and dyeing establishments, machine shops, sheet metal shops, warehouses, cold storage plants, lumber yards, building material sales yards, contractors, equipment storage yards, and it allows, you know, certain conditional uses on M1 zone lots and temporary workforce housing. what just concerns me about this bill is that the arguments that we are using to adopt the rezoning of this bill, I can't help but ask why they would not be applicable to all, many other properties on Guam. And does that mean that the legislature should then rezone, in mass, many other properties on Guam? And we don't do that. The legislature, for many, many years has established a Guam Land Use Commission to give each of these rezonings the consideration that it deserves and that the community deserves. Some of the testimony has said that the Guam Land Use Commission, the rezoning is slow, but I don't think that's actually been the case for these properties. It's been, according to the testimony, these properties, it's just some of them are tied up in probate, so those people have not attempted to rezone their property. And two of these properties have been rezoned. One was done by the legislature. I'm not sure the other one, but the point is that not all of these property owners have even applied to the Guam Land Use Commission, so I don't see that there's a problem per se with the Guam Land Use Commission considering the rezoning of these lots. I don't know that any of the landowners in this area has been denied by the Guam Land Use Commission. But through the Guam Land Use Commission, and I guess through this bill too, all adjacent properties owners would have been notified. The village, according to existing laws and laws that were just passed in the last term of the Guam legislature, the Village Municipal Planning Council would have to have conducted its own public hearing and had, passed resolutions regarding this. There would have been a billboard announcing on the property that it was going to be rezoned for, in advance. They would have announced that. Every agency would have had examined the potential use and the ability of the infrastructure, the safety of the proposed use of the property, and other potential impacts on the surrounding community. And the testimony also shows that the surrounding community, and the map in front of us shows that the surrounding community, and I think it's very notable here, includes an elementary school, a high school, and this is one of the high schools, if I recall the news correctly, that was just closed when we had, because of inadequate water supply. The mayor did bring up the point about access, and so we're told now that this access is going to be open, but I'm concerned that the access is not going to be open until after this rezoning is done, and I haven't seen anything in writing about, that access or, DPW's plans for it, but I know that the mayor's been asking for access to be open for years. And I remember when we were all suffering from the tri-intersection road repair, the entire community was asking why we could not open up additional access. So I am concerned about the timing of this access and when it's going to be open, and I would think that that should be done prior to the rezoning of all these properties, because the access was tied very closely to her concerns about safety, access for emergency equipment, and of course traffic and impacts on the community. The lot that the legislature previously zoned to M1, and we are now relying on as part of the adjacent properties that would be consistent to this M1 mass rezoning. I looked at that a little bit, and the mayor and the MPC opposed that rezoning by the legislature at the time. The owner had not applied to the Guam Land Use Commission, and this was not complaining of a delay. The owner of that property was an existing business, and didn't appear to have any impediment to going to the Guam Land Use Commission. Just, I think in the last session, one of these sessions recently, we've rezoned property in Tizen from A to R1. And so that was the only the second like mass rezoning that the legislature has done. The first one was when it rezoned, or it zoned for the first time, the property that, all property that had been returned to original landowners to A, agriculture. And then recently, we in the legislature rezoned another different part of Tizen from agriculture to R1, residential, to allow them to live on those properties. We did not rezone the property where that the original landowners owned, that the government of Guam or the airport eventually took over when they did the condemnation for the new roadway, the new, what do they call it? Anyways, the new roadway that cuts through Tizen. Before we recondemned that property, they did not, or purchased that property, they did not rezone it, like what is being proposed today. The Guam Land Use Commission process allows that each individual property owner is going to give adequate notice of the intended use of the property, more specifics, and how the infrastructure of the area will accommodate that use. The process allows landowners to be heard and surrounding neighbors. It requires village meetings, and we have seen that the villages, or the people in the villages, are becoming more and more active. They're paying more attention to these rezonings. I don't know if it's the signs, but it's just word of mouth. It's really, the people are becoming more active, proactive in paying attention to rezoning and objecting to zonings or variances that they feel are not compatible with their community. And I would like to give the people in Barrigada that opportunity. In prior Guam Land Use Commission hearings, we've seen this 24-unit apartment complex in Pago Bay be turned down. And that's just an R2. We've seen a store in Windward Hills be turned down, a windmill in Mangilao be turned down, in large part because of the community's objections. I feel like the legislature should be encouraging the people in these villages to give input on a project-by-project basis, as is by the design of the Land Use Commission currently, and as is required of all other property owners on Guam. I guess I just don't see that it's a compelling rush to rezone all 40 lots when not all of these landowners are actively requesting this, and because of the risks that come with it. It may be that this would grant a different, I mean, obviously it would immediately change the value of the property and increase the value. And I don't know if these properties are going to be sold or if the airport intends to use them for some purpose. I'm not sure what is intended for these properties down the line. But again, I think in order for the community to know whether the benefit, outweighs the risks, that they need to know more detail, and that they should be given this opportunity on a lot-by-lot basis. Otherwise, I'm afraid that the Guam Land Use Commission has become obsolete, because, I mean, I can see the legislature, of course, I agree we have the authority to rezone, but to mass rezone, huge sections of Guam and not consider the others, I'm very concerned about that, the precedent that it sets, and and the fairness to all the other landowners that have had to go through that process for many, many years. And if it's good for this property to be zoned M1, even though it's next to schools, it's adjacent to the village of Barrigada, the residential section of Barrigada, the mom and pop stores. I mean, if it's okay for this property to be rezoned M1, I mean, are we saying that it's okay for almost any other property on Guam to be rezoned to M1? I guess I'm having a hard time distinguishing this and other properties. There was one public hearing for this bill. It was in the village of Barrigada. It was not that well attended. In fact, I don't even recall if any of the landowners testified at that time. But we have received letters from the landowners since then. But as I said, this legislature required just last term that for a variance and rezoning, that the landowners would have to go through an entire municipal planning council hearing and public meetings. I'm afraid that none of the people in Barrigada are going to be heard after this bill passes as to whether the industrial use that they bring to this property exacerbates the flooding in Barrigada. We were just in a public hearing recently with the mayor talking about flooding issues and how she wants to go and block the landowner in I don't remember, an A or an R1 area from building a house. She wants to block them from building a house because they've had to go out there with jet skis to rescue people because of the flooding in these areas. We don't know about the noise issues in the airport, how this is going to play together, the traffic coming in and out. This is the things that the community should have input. Does this exacerbate traffic? Does opening the roads, and when were those roads opening, does that assist or exacerbate the traffic in this area? We see that the mayor has, since her last objection, submitted something that said to allow it to be put on the session floor, but I haven't seen in this file that the Municipal Planning Council has revoked its resolution objecting to this. The mayor, at the same time that she submitted that letter saying, you know, she removes her objection, go ahead and put it on the agenda, also submitted a 4-page letter outlining her continued concerns with rezoning all of these lots at once to M1. So I just feel, Mr. Speaker, that, you know, there are still considerations that the people of Barrigada, I think, would want to be brought to their attention for the use of these properties. I mean, this, if I can understand this correctly, this map even includes the recreational areas. Is that not in here? Okay, sorry, then I don't know what's that at the far right corner. But we know that the mayor has another bill that the legislature has another bill to consider use of the recreational areas in Tizen, and actually this is actually adjacent to or in property that is being used now for the Gate Theater. And I can't remember what else, but I do remember reading, you know, there are the school uses, the Gate Theater uses, and other uses that, according to the landowners, an M1 industrial use is consistent with those uses. But I can't imagine that the community, I mean, I don't know, just from my experience in Jotnya, that the community does not see those to be consistent. To put an industrial park next to a school or a residential area. I mean, we know, I mean, the mayor has said to me personally, we don't want another Harmon Industrial Park, but I've heard from when this bill was here before that, I mean, that's exactly what we're intending, is an industrial park. And I don't know, I just think there's none of us that would really want to go live in Harmon Industrial Park because of what we've, it allows many, many uses of property that might be your neighbor. And so, Mr. Speaker, I just think we owe the mayor and the people of Barrigada an opportunity to have the input that we have said in prior legislations and in creating the Guam Land Use Commission that they would have input on every use of every property that was coming up from then. And, I don't want to deny the original landowners justice, and I just don't feel that the government of Guam is in this case going to be denying any justice. The government, when this property was given over, it was given by the federal government to the government of Guam. And it was the government of Guam that went out of its way to try to create its own form of justice for these landowners, and did the same for all the landowners where they could. They returned the property to them, and they continued to work on that. But they did not go and rezone all of original landowners' property to M1 and make it more valuable. And we know that a lot of that property's been sold since that time. I don't want to. We need to decide, I think, whether the Guam Land Use Commission should continue, whether it's a just system for all the people of Guam, or if it's just going to be a system that, those that don't have legislative connection have to use. And so I don't want to create another injustice. I mean, on top of the injustices that these landowners have suffered, I just want to allow that, if that process is a good process, and I see it as a good process to allow the community input on a piece-by-piece basis, that we allow that, and that we stick to our original systems that allow for that type of review and not create another advantage for some property owners over the others. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to? Senator Tallina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a couple questions for the sponsors of the bill, if they are willing to yield to them.
Pose them. You may pose the question.
Thank you. The Municipal Planning Council of Barrigada, I know in the introduction it was mentioned that it addressed several concerns. The first one was the concern that we have that the mayor of Barrigada Municipal Planning Council does not support legislative zoning or rezoning. We have seen what legislative zoning can do. I'm reading from the resolution. We have seen what legislative zoning can do while the rezoning goes through the legislative route. We have seen the role of the Department of Land Management and other regulating agencies diminish. My question is, what is the purpose of an all-inclusive legislative zoning? I mean, I've never seen this where, well, because it's my first time here and looking at this, but I've never seen this practice done where we zone a large parcel of land with different landowners. That's one question.
The question, either one of you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, South Tizen, when the quitclaim deed was received from the military, it was clear in that document that the intent in returning this was that that land was going to continue to be used for industrial and commercial activities, which is what the military had used it for decades prior to returning the land. And so the government of Guam created the Komitea para Tizon to develop a land use plan for South Tizon. That was a requirement before turnover will be effected. And that plan had to be approved by the federal government. And so all that was done. And the government of Guam said, yes, we will take back these lands and they will continue to be used for industrial and commercial uses. And then 2 years later, after it received it, government of Guam turned around and returned the lands to the original landowners. Now, because the government of Guam agreed to receive the lands and to continue the use as industrial, remediation of that property up there, the 248 acres, was remediated to the level of that would be suitable for industrial and commercial activities. Now, if somebody wanted to come in there to build, make it zone it to be a R1, something lower than commercial or industrial, then the cost of remediating further the properties will have to be at the expense of the landowners. But all this bill is doing is it's basically putting in that final piece that the government of Guam had agreed to utilize these properties when it received it back. Now, quite frankly, I don't know if there was a reversionary clause in there. If there was, it probably wouldn't be exercised. But that's why it's being rezoned en masse. And we did something similar last session when we rezoned the housing area. When that tract of land got returned, it was returned with the understanding that it was going to be continued to be used for housing, because that's what it was used for decades.
Is that satisfactory, Senator?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another issue, I guess, explanation that was brought up was rezoning expense of the landowners. Would this rezoning require them to pay anything?
Anybody yield?
Yes, the bill clearly shows on page 4, paragraph G, rezoning fee. Each lot owner will be assessed a fee of $640. $640 to the government, if the government was going to if we're going to go this route. If they're going to go through their normal route, it'll probably cost them about $6,000.
Okay. So then the government would be losing out in some money. Right?
No, the government won't be making a profit the way the private land agents would.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Another question I have is, how does this impact the areas of recreation, the football field, the baseball fields?
Do you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, the baseball field is the baseball field on the northeast side, and the South Tizon side is separate and apart. So I don't know how, I don't know, I don't see that it will affect it, quite frankly. Right now you got a school that's closest to where the recreation center is. You got, where the football field, the baseball, and all that.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand that we're trying to do a rezoning in the middle of a school and recreational areas. And one last question, Mr. Speaker. Has all landowners been notified of this possible rezoning?
What we're talking about is
And has there been any response in return?
or rather, where's the
And that will be my last question.
The floor is with Senator Nelson. If you have any questions, and ask it so that Senator Atta, please restate your question.
Thank you. My question is, have all the landowners been notified of this possible rezoning? Yes.
As far as I know, most of the landowners, I'm sure many of you have received letters from several of the landowners who are certainly interested in this particular bill. But no, land management has not sent out notifications because the bill has not been enacted. But that's going to be one of the first requirements for land management if this bill should get enacted, is to notify the landowners of this opportunity.
So then not all landowners have been notified because the bill has not been enacted. So then after the fact, perhaps if they oppose the rezoning.
Well, remember,
then
this is
it's already
purely
been decided.
voluntary. So the land management, the way it will work is that the land management, using the records that it has, will send out notifications saying, you know, Bill 13 has just been enacted. You have 90 days to come in and either opt in and say, yes, I want my land rezoned to M1, or you can just do nothing and the zoning status remains at agriculture. But then subsequently, then they have to go through the normal process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the motion? Senator Castro. Senator Stiglitz, did you have your hand up? No. Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a resident of Maragata and former member of the MPC, I just want to rise in support of the bill and thank the chair and prime sponsor, Senator Tom Castro-Atta, and the co-sponsor, Senator Espaldon, for allowing an extended opportunity to the Maragata MPC, the mayor, and the vice mayor to openly discuss those concerns that were expressed in a May 25th, 2017 letter. And a copy of the letter is in the supplemental committee report. I and myself, along with some senators and their representatives, met with the MPC and the mayor and the vice mayor not once, Mr. Speaker, but twice. And as Senator Atta mentioned, and I can attest, such concerns as raised by the mayor and the MPC and the vice mayor were cured. So with this said, again, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank the chair and the prime sponsor for his due diligence and professionalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, you've been heard.
Heard, but could we just confirm the lot, Mr. Speaker? That
The question that
the yellow triangle.
question that the senator was asking was, she's under the impression that the recreational fields are within the South Teason. It is not. In fact, the quitclaim deed for those recreational lots, from the basketball court down below, the football, the 2 baseball fields, where the the area where the Liberation Day Carnival, that was turned over on a separate quitclaim deed. The South Teason, the lots that we're talking about, were specifically under a different quitclaim deed, which lists down in fact, the bill identifies the lot numbers that are affected by Bill 13.
Thank you very much. It's just that if you look at the maps that have been passed out, the yellow block and then the one after that where it delineates the roads, the post office is right there, and right next to the post office are the recreational areas.
Thank you. You may close, Senator Atta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of my colleagues had certainly raised a lot of concerns, very valid questions, concerns that, the same concerns that the mayor had raised. And so before I close, I would like to just very quickly address them. One was the issue about mass rezoning to M1. Are we now going to go to a village and say, okay, everything in this block here is going to be rezoned? Of course not. As I explained earlier, the reason why South Tizon is being rezoned to M1 was because the Guam land use, the Tizon land use master plan indicated that these lots were going to be used for industrial and commercial activities. So certainly the proposed M1 rezoning is appropriate. We did the same thing similar for the residential area, the old officers' housing in Tizon. The question about access. Again, it shows there on page 3 of those handouts, it shows Mariner Avenue. Those are already surveyed and severed rights of way. And remaining on each end is probably about 200 to 300 feet of asphalt that needs to be laid out. And it's just a matter of, you know, right now it's not DPW's priority, but it's there. It's laid out. It's waiting to be asphalted. The same with Corsair. You've seen that, the tri-intersection. You know, why it's not opened yet, I don't know. But those are the legal accesses into that area. And so that's already been addressed. Now it's just a matter of DPW coming in to complete it. The question about the Municipal Planning Council and public hearings and giving the residents of Barrigada an opportunity to come in and voice their concerns or whatever. We did have. The committee brought out this bill to the Municipal Planning Council at their duly noticed meeting, and we made the presentation there, and there were some landowners there or representatives, so, you know, it hasn't been done in a vacuum. We had a public hearing down here. Senator Castro, who's a member of the MPC, also had arranged for another meeting with the mayor to go over these concerns. So, you know, you can only do so much. Ask to have a meeting, ask to be given the opportunity to present, but if nobody comes to your party, what can you do? The question about have we looked at, is there enough supporting infrastructure to go in there? Water, power, sewer. Well, that's why in the public law, our public laws require that if we're going to do any legislative rezoning, a land zoning consideration report is a prerequisite prior to putting a bill on the agenda. That has been received already. And the input that goes into that land zoning consideration report are the same agencies that would give input if it went through GLUC. The only difference is that they have a shorter time frame to respond to the request. The issue about, there's probably a lot of landowners that's still in probate, and I know that there's a family that's come to my office many times. They've been in probate for probably as long as since day one when the land got returned to them. They were in probate, and apparently my understanding is that probates, you know, it's probably the lowest in the totem pole of the judicial system. That's why it takes so long. And that is, but then also recognizing that, I do have an amendment that I would like to put on real quickly to address the probate issue. And finally, and very importantly, is the concern that are we going to end up like with another Harmon Industrial Park? No, we're not, because the two are very different. Harmon Industrial Park was basically a tract of land with various lots that weren't planned out. A lot here, a lot there, a lot everywhere. And so landowners went in and built within their lots. And you end up with what you got down at Harmon Industrial Park. At Tizon, it's actually laid out a lot better than what's done at Harmon. So the two are not the same. And, you know, for the decades that the military has been there, I don't know that it's caused any problems anywhere else. So I share their concerns, and because of that, we went and we checked. You know, well, how do we know it's not going to turn out to be a gaggle like Harmon? How do we get in and out? Because if that private property owner closes that road today, everybody is, you know, up the creek without a paddle. So, Mr. Speaker, before I close, I would just like to make, if I may, an amendment on, and I've passed around the amendment sheet. On page 3, line 15, it reads there, affirmation of zoning. And this is the section that basically gives landowners 90 working days to come in and provide written affirmation as to whether they want, through the legislative process, to rezone their property. And the land management director has indicated 180 days is probably more reasonable. So I would like to make that amendment to change on line 15, page 3, to change from 90 days to 180 days.
On that amendment, anyone wish to be heard on it? On that amendment, anyone wish to be heard on it? Thank you.
And
Your
yes.
second amendment?
No. I was bifurcating it. On the same amendment sheet, Mr. Speaker, there's a second paragraph there which addresses the issue about, well, what about the land owners or the cases that are still in probate? Until it gets done, until that probate is completed, they really don't know what they want on that, whether they want to rezone it or not. So on that amendment sheet, the continuation then of that paragraph C is to add in a second paragraph below that reads, in the case of pending probate court distributions, within 180 working days from the Department of Land Management recordation of the final decree of distribution, owners of the lots listed in subsection A or their duly authorized representatives must provide written affirmation to the director of the Department of Land Management. And all that means is that after they finish at probate court and everybody is happy that, okay, brother 1 is going to get this lot and brother 2 is going to get that lot, then they go to land management, they record those, and then 180 days from that date of recordation, these new landowners of the subdivided land must now, if they want to take advantage of the M1 zoning or up to M1, then they have 180 days to do that. So that's the second amendment that I would like to make to subsection C. Subsection C in section 2 there.
On the second amendment proffered by Senator Rada, any senator wish to be heard on that amendment? Senator Mary Torres.
I'd like to pose a question if the author was so yield. What I'm concerned about with this amendment is it would seem logical to me that given the footprint of the area, that it would be unreasonable to have an array of, to have both agricultural and M1 interspersed within that one footprint. And so in contemplating this bill, does it make more sense to not provide for an election of the type of zoning, whether to convert from agricultural to M1 or to just designate the whole area as M1, because I do see a conflict in incompatible uses. I mean, we know that at first when I was looking at it, you know, the airport is on one border, followed by the schools, and then it's also bifurcated by a road and a highway. But to suggest that lots situated side by side can be interspersed in a checkerboard fashion where you have one A and then the other M1, maybe M1 and then an A. So if you were, I just want to ask the author, in his opinion, is this the most logical way to address all concerns, or would it be better as a policy to just have one fell swoop change in zoning as contemplated by the deed when it was in 2000, September 2000, when the land was returned with the proviso that the use of the property would be limited to industrial and commercial use? If that's the case, that was the proviso for the return of the land, should we in this act then just convert the whole thing and not leave it optional? Because I do see some potential conflict and maybe incompatible use of the properties if you have such a disparity between an agricultural zone lot and an M1 lot that are situated side by side, or one can saddle the other, or two can saddle one. It just seems like we may be creating an undesirable situation. So if he can yield to that question.
Senator Adam?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the biggest concern in just painting everything with the same paintbrush as M1 is that there are land tax implications to these landowners, and it may very well be that landowner is just not ready to especially if it's a large landowner, to assume the burden of an M1 zone property, and would rather maybe just keep it at agriculture, and he's gonna and then he'll give it to them, and then let the kids worry about rezoning it or whatever. And so that was the biggest concern about not just making everything M1 as opposed to up to M1.
That's satisfactory, Senator Torres?
That is, and actually that I can understand then if it's a matter of facilitating those that are ready to move ahead, but not burdening those that aren't ready to absorb the financial implications of changing the designation from agricultural to M1, then I can see the logic behind that. I just raised that because it did seem like it was nonsensical, but with that explanation, I can see why that is a condition that is placed here. So I have no objections. Thank you.
Thank you. On the amendment?
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading a letter from the Department of Land Management that points out that this property is, it includes within its boundaries the Guam Main Postal Facility, the schools, and the recreational areas, the multi-purpose sports facility under Department of Parks and Rec. And so if it goes from the post office to the tri-intersection, it includes all those sports fields inside those that are right behind the schools. But it also points out that adjacent to this rezoned M1 lot will be, in fact, R1 agriculture and other uses adjacent to the M1.
Thank you. Anything further on the amendment? On the amendment, any objection to the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? There's an objection. All those in favor of sending the bill down to the voting file, please indicate by raising your hand. Thank you. Second on the agenda is Bill 24-34, Senator Snickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 24-34 seeks to have a report on the monthly collections of our Department of Revenue and Taxation provided to this body for us to be able to basically evaluate what the cash is in our government as far as the collections goes. We are constantly tossed back and forth between revenues and collections. 1 minute we're told money's there, the next minute we're told there's no cash. This report will give us a full breakdown of what the cash is that has been actually collected, but it'll also tell us a little bit more. In particular, Mr. Speaker, on page 2, line 19, will tell us about the abatements. Abatements are the amounts that were supposed to have been collected, but were written off for a variety of reasons. When I reviewed some of these reports in the past, the amount of abatements can actually be quite alarming. And they tell a story of how much money we could have had if we had just collected. And so I asked my colleagues to please join me in supporting this bill. Not very complicated. It just requires Rev and Tax to provide us with a collections report on a monthly basis, as well as to Magalahan Guahan, so we can all have an idea of how much collections are actually coming into this government on a monthly basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. On the main motion, Bill 24-34, any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Just have a question, Mr. Speaker, of the author, if he would yield as to whether Department of Revenue and Tax objected to this bill.
Do you yield?
We have no objection on the record, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard on Bill 24-34? If not, you're welcome to close. On the motion to send Bill 24 to the voting file, any objection? The third on the agenda is Bill 56-34. Senator Abbott, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to pass on file.
Thank you. Bill 63-34, Senator Snickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bills 63, 64, and 65 are all actually very similar in nature. Bill 63 seeks to require the Director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation to determine the Guam-sourced income generated from federally contracted activity by contractors who do not file their taxes on Guam. Reconcile such information with the Section 30 reimbursements attributable to such income and report its findings to the Governor and to this body. Mr. Speaker, Section 30 income is traditionally income that is brought in to the coffers of the government from the taxes that are collected from military personnel. However, Section 30 is actually much more broad than that in the Organic Act that authorizes those monies to be collected. It's written there in Section 2 on page 1, starting on line 6. A listener in Guahan finds that Section 1421H of 48 U.S.C. Section 30 of the Organic Act of Guam reads in part, quote, all custom duties and federal income taxes derived from Guam, the proceeds of all taxes collected under the internal revenue laws of the United States on articles produced in Guam and transported to the United States, its territories or possessions, or consumed in Guam, and the proceeds of any other taxes which may be levied by the Congress on the inhabitants of Guam, including but not limited to compensation paid to members of the armed forces and pensions paid to retired civilians and military employees of the United States or their survivors who are residents of or who are domiciled in Guam, and all quarantine, passport, immigration, and naturalization fees collected in Guam shall be covered into the Treasury of Guam and held in account for the government of Guam, and shall be expended for the benefit and government of Guam in accordance with the annual budgets. Mr. Speaker, this particular Bill 63 would require a review of all expanded data sources, including a website. We actually very specifically named this website in this bill. It's the usaspending.gov website. If anybody pulls up on their laptops or on their mobile device and punches into the Google search or into the URL line there, usaspending.gov, it'll take you to a website. Very, very easy to use. You just basically punch in Guam on the website, and every single federal contract, federal grant, federal loan pops up. You can filter all of those contracts, all of those grants, and all of those loans by year, and from there you can see every single contract that was awarded for that particular calendar year. From that list, it's very simple for the Department of Revenue and Taxation to reconcile that to whether or not those actual companies pay their taxes here on Guam. If there's any contractor showing up on that list that does not have a tax return filed in the territory, that means that they're filing their taxes in the mainland United States. And that means that based on Section 30 of the Organic Act, we should be making claim for those taxes because they were derived from Guam. They were income that was derived on Guam. And so in an effort to try and make sure that we are bringing in every single dollar in Section 30 to which we are entitled to by virtue of the Organic Act, this bill would require the Department of Revenue and Taxation to reconcile all of those contractors using that resource and determine whether or not they have paid their taxes on Guam and to file that report with this body. So this is one of several attempts that I'm going to be making in this session, Mr. Speaker, to try and bolster our Section 30 revenue, help us bring in more money, help us meet more of the needs of this community. And that is my opening statement, Mr. Speaker, on Bill 63. I do have an amendment on all three that I needed to make. On page 2, Section 3, we do require a report to be filed after they do an initial review within 180 days, but we did not include the language necessary for this review to be done on an annualized basis. And so I have an amendment here for Bill 63-34 on page 2, line 27. After the word act, basically a continuation of the last sentence, adding the words, and thereafter the first business day in January of every calendar year for the preceding 12 months. It's also drafted in writing if it needs to be circulated.
Does everybody understand the amendment being proffered by the Senator? Does anybody understand the amendment being proffered by the Senator, and does anyone wish to speak on the amendment being proffered? On the amendment proffered by Senator San Nicolas, any objection?
I yield the floor, Mr. Speaker, to any questions or comments.
On the main, Senator Estevez, on the main motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker. I rise in utmost support of this bill. While my colleague and I may not always agree, I must commend him on this bill. This finely written, introduced bill. Mr. Speaker, this is something that I was looking into myself. Talking with business owners, there's been a lot of discussion about certain loopholes with regards to all filing companies filing their taxes and using these loopholes to avoid filing taxes and furthermore avoid paying the full scope of the taxes due the people of Guam based off Section 30. I do ask for a potential amendment and for the consideration of both the author and my colleagues that on page 2, line 23, that we strike who do not file their taxes on Guam. And that's only, Mr. Speaker, is because when we start looking at these large multi-million-dollar contractors with subsidiaries as a parent company and smaller companies and other shell companies, they do a really good job at hiding their money, what they file on Guam, what they don't file on Guam, where they move assets in terms of what they want to claim. So I think if we kind of lock key it with that specific portion who do not file their taxes on Guam, it becomes a bit more difficult to maybe get the clearer picture. So I would ask that we consider that amendment, as well as on line 16, removing that portion who do not file their taxes on Guam. So anything derived from a federal contract in its entirety should be filed on Guam and should be addressed on Guam. And being able to track what money goes to the states, goes back and forth, kind of avoids those loopholes within the law.
On the Estevez amendment, any senator wish to be heard on the Estevez amendment? Those two points to add, to remove the words "who file on Guam." Any objection to the Senator Nicholas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not necessarily an objection, but the whole intent of this particular bill was to target the funding that we already are not getting in terms of reports that are being filed. For example, if you do file on Guam, like your black construction, and you file your taxes here on Guam, you would not have to be a part of this reporting requirement for the Department of Revenue and Taxation to compile, because they would be able to look at all the contractors on that website, spot you, say, yeah, they do file their taxes, we're not going to include them in the report. If we amend this out, we're going to be including every single contractor in this report, even if they are already filing their taxes here. What I'm seeking to target in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, is more so those contracts that are awarded for Guam, but paid out in the home state of wherever the corporation is located. So for example, if it's a consulting contract or some kind of an engineering contract, and the corporate office is in Vermont, and the federal government awards it for the Guam project, but it's paid to the Vermont office, it will be paid to the Vermont office. They'll file a federal income tax return, not a Guam tax return, but that income was derived from Guam. And that would then be a Section 30 claim, because then the government of Guam will go to the federal government and say, you paid out a $10 million contract to this company. It did not file its taxes here. Did it file it with you? If the answer is yes, this is our Section 30 receipt. Please pay it to us, because based on Section 30, that money is due here. So that's why the language is very specific, that it's only going to be for those who do not file on Guam. If we remove it, it will be a much larger report. Every single federal contract, whether or not they file on Guam, will have to be included. It's more exhaustive. The reason why I would prefer to have it winnowed down to the ones that do not file is that we can also have a very clear picture as to just how big this problem is here on the island. So I don't necessarily stand in opposition to the amendment, but I think that keeping the language as it is would provide for a more concise report to the very specific group that we're trying to target, which is those contractors that are not paying their taxes here, but are getting the contracts here. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Any other senators? Oh, Senator
Can you
Torres.
just please repeat the amendment? It was unclear. I couldn't really hear that well.
Yes. First amendment would be on line 16, page 2, generated from federally contracted activity by contractors. I propose to strike who do not file their taxes on Guam, who do not file their taxes on Guam, and then continue on, reconcile such information. And then that same striking on line 23, who do not file their taxes on Guam.
Then I would object, because I think that is what this bill is about. It's really targeting those that do not file their taxes on Guam. So I think it's a necessary part of this bill. So I would object to striking it.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Estevez amendment? Any other senator wish to be heard on the Estevez amendment? Senator Estevez, do you wish to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of the amendment, when we look at the way different companies break down, let's say I'm a multi-million-dollar company and I have a federal contract and I have a small office on Guam. Based on the language here, I file my taxes on Guam, a small portion. Yet, based on the contract, I'm paying expenses towards the parent company, which files in the States. Doesn't necessarily catch all the taxes and basically all the taxation that's being done with this these projects. Based on Section 30 under the Organic Act, all revenues derived from a contract is supposed to stay on Guam and be filed on Guam. The company's supposed to file it on Guam. I think in an effort for me, even though it seems a bit more expansive, because of the way these businesses are able to transfer money between corporations and finesse the tax systems and how they file, I think keeping this in there could create a potential loophole for those same companies that we're trying to ascertain as to whether or not they're paying the full complement of the taxes owed to the people of Guam. So again, I think this will still be in keeping with the intent of the bill, and it'll give the body, again, I commend the author of it, this will give the body and the government really a better picture of how much money actually is going out with these federal contracts, and if we're actually getting the money that we're due back on Guam. So I think this just expands on it. I know it may expand a bit much, but my concern again with not striking that is that they'll find a loophole not to meet the intent of the legislation. So I ask my colleagues to please consider the amendment. Thank you.
Okay, there's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. Do you wish, any other senator wish to be heard? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. I think it's a very good bill, and I hope that it can achieve its purposes. I note that for this bill and 63 and for Bill 64 and 65, that the Department of Revenue and Taxation has submitted a testimony a day after the hearing that says it doesn't support the bill for the following reasons, and the reasons are related to the sensitivity of the tax matters involved, and apparently the reports are tax sensitive and confined to those in need. But when I look at the bill, and the bill says that the department should reconcile the information and report its findings for further action, I'm hoping that that this language still allows them to do the reports without violating any confidentiality provisions that they may be bound to. And I think it's very important information for the government, and so I hope that they do find a way to do it, and I think that bill allows them that type of flexibility. So I just wanted to put that on the record, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to speak? Senator Camacho Torres on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I initially read this bill, I was not in favor of it. I thought that at first it was trespassing on the authority of the governor to manage his own agencies. I thought that perhaps the information is readily available on usaspending.gov website, and that we can make all the audits that we wanted from our end. But then as I thought about it, notwithstanding the fact that the Department of Revenue and Taxation has so many other obligations that they feel that they don't have adequate resources to address, I think that what we did in this budget cycle is we provided for salaries for additional manpower at Revenue and Taxation. And I also think that notwithstanding the fact that maybe a very bright mind within our staff can look at the contracts and the spending and try and ascertain whether the the numbers that are being captured are short or within the range of the mark, the fact that the Department of Revenue and Taxation will be the certifying source of the information is relevant and important. And given the fact that the legislature is tasked with with appropriating monies and adequately projecting for revenue sources, it makes sense that we would want to have as much information, that is very precise in tracking and reconciling revenue sources, that we put those measures in place. So at the risk of overburdening our already burdened Department of Revenue and Taxation, I believe that this measure is necessary at this time in Guam's history, and that we do, especially with major projects coming forward with the military buildup, that we do adequately track all revenues that are due to Guam, and that we do it in this fashion. So I rise in support. I am sensitive to the burdens that we place, and I'm sensitive to the semblance of micromanagement, but I think that when it comes to the revenues, the revenue projections, the revenue collections, and the revenue reporting, that it is not outside of the legislature's authority and discretion to mandate certain things. So in this case, I would make an exception to what I initially would think is a bit much on our part and support this measure, because I think at this point, capturing adequate revenues for Guam that are rightfully due to Guam be afforded to us. So I rise in full support of Bill 63-34. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I definitely support the intent of this legislation for basically the reasons that have been stated by the previous speakers. However, in some of the information that was presented earlier by one of the previous speakers, the comment was made that the Department of Revenue and Taxation opposes this bill on grounds that tax information is confidential, and the working relationship between DRT and the IRS needs to be maintained and strengthened. That's basically the opposition. Bottom line, DRT believes it cannot share the tax information with anyone not authorized by IRS to examine such information. I guess the question to the author is, the wording here is that the Director of Revenue Taxation shall determine the Guam source income generated from federal contracted activity by contractors who do not file taxes on Guam, reconcile such information with the Section 30 reimbursements attributable to such income, and report its findings for further action. I suppose the question is, what is contemplated by this bill? Because Revenue Tax is saying, well, no, we can't share any tax information, but I think that's only relevant to individual filings. And I just want to make sure that it's very clear to all here who are going to vote on this, as well as perhaps all the general public who is listening, whether this legislation really impinges upon that confidentiality of access to information of individual taxes. It seems to me pretty clear, or at least I would assume, that we're just asking, through this legislation, we take all that information, kind of give us a general scope of what income really, and what taxes due on what income, on the income derived on island, and report to us on that, not necessarily for the names of individual companies, but I'm not sure. So I pose that question, and if the author would yield, I would appreciate a better understanding.
You yield.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I do appreciate the question. I was going to elaborate on the closing statements, but it spares us. The way this was written was very specific on page 2, lines 22 and 23. The Director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation shall, utilizing expanded data sources, including the USA Spending website, determine the Guam-sourced income generated from federally contracted activity by contractors, reconcile such information, as in reconcile that income information, if we need to clarify that we can, reconcile such information with the Section 30 reimbursements attributable to such income and report the findings. So what this would mandate is that Revenue Tax would look at the income only and then determine whether or not we have received the Section 30 reimbursement for that income, and if not, report how much money we have not received. That way, the legislature can work with the governor and get with the feds and say, hey, you know what? Based on our calculations, you did not give us another $10 million in Section 30 money that we believe should be remitted. And so the whole way that this is being written is not to reveal taxpayer information, but to reveal the amounts that would be relative to the activity that should have been remitted to the territory.
Thank you. Is that satisfactory, Senator?
Yes, and that was what I assumed to be the answer. But again, just for clarity's sake, I wanted to hear that and needed to hear that from the author. And it does make sense, and it seems to alleviate the argument that Reverend Tax had put out about their hesitancy on this bill and basically their opposition to this bill. But with that explanation, I do support this piece of legislation, and I thank the author for answering the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on Bill 63, the main motion? On the main motion, if not, Senator Snickles, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the sentiments that were proffered with respect to clarifying whether or not this is going to reveal any taxpayer information. I would like to proffer an amendment on page 2, line 24. After the word such, just include the word income. After on line 24, after the word such, include the words income, so it'll be reconcile such income information.
Okay, the amendment being proffered is to add the word income after the word source.
Such.
Such. Such. Any objection or any comment? Any objection? Thank you. You may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to close, these bills, these series of bills have nothing to do with trying to micromanage anybody. When evaluating the Section 30 code, we just saw that there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to capture more revenue potentially, and for us to be able to work together, legislature and administration, because this is going to be about us going to the feds and saying, hey, you have an outstanding bill that's gone unpaid. What's interesting about these series of bills, but I'll speak to Bill 63 in particular, is that there's historical data. If you go to the website, you can see contractors going back to, I believe, 2008. And so Revenue Tax can go back and reconcile all of that back to 2008. And if we're lucky, or if we were unlucky up to this point, if they reconcile that, hey, you know what, we have a balance due, we may be able to get a windfall from this analysis. And so I humbly ask my colleagues for their support. I humbly ask Imagalahan Guahan for his support. I think that by working together, this can help us to ensure that we capture all of the contractor revenue, which is something that's most important given this military buildup and the propensity for some of that revenue to escape. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? Oh, yes.
Mr. Speaker, I understand I may be out of order, but I do have, I'd like to proffer an amendment that I think might solidify a point that was raised, a point of concern, and make the language a little stronger, if it's not too late. On page 2, line 16, there were two areas on page 2, line 16, and on page 2, line 23, with the words at the end of line 16, who do not file their taxes. What I propose might be another way of wording it so that we can avoid any loopholes, potential loopholes, is to say instead, who file taxes in a jurisdiction other than Guam.
Does everybody understand that motion, that amendment? Is there an objection to the amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Speaker, that same amendment would apply to line
in
16 and line
20 also.
23.
On the amendment to line 20? Any objection to the amendment on line 20? So we just approved two amendments on line 16 and line 20 who file in jurisdictions other than Guam. Yes.
Just as a matter, if I may ask the author, line 16 and line 20?
I believe that's what I
Or
was.
was it
23?
23?
23.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
My mistake. Okay? Senator Nicholas, on the motion to send, Senator Nicholas? On the motion to send the bill down, do you have any objections? No? Bill 64-34, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Similar to Bill 63, Bill 64 is seeking for us to be able to pursue additional Section 30 reimbursements using that particular part of the Organic Act. But this time we're talking about a very different kind of tax. And when my staff was researching this, we found it to be quite interesting. For every airline ticket that is bought and sold, Mr. Speaker, there is an air transportation tax that is paid. And based on our research, this tax is not remitted to the territory. It's remitted to the Federal Aviation Administration. However, this tax is paid by the inhabitants of Guam. It is derived from Guam. And the amounts have a range. Going all the way back to 1970, this tax was assessed. It started at $3 in 1970. It's up to $17.80 in 2016. And this tax is assessed on any arrival and departure. We got some information here from the citizen-centric report from the AB Wampat International Airport Authority. In 2016, we had 1.58 million arrivals. That comes out at $17.80 per arrival to $27 million in air transportation taxes. When you look at the entire citizen-centric report starting from 2011 to 2016, you multiply it by the corresponding passenger amount. For those 5 years, we should have brought in $148 million in air transportation taxes. That's assuming that every single arrival and departure into Guam is a tax that is payable to Guam. The case can be made that it should be because it was derived from Guam, but at the very least, a case can be made that anytime the inhabitants of Guam, the people of Guam, or those who are already covered under Section 30, which is the military personnel on Guam, if any of those groups pay this air transportation tax, that tax should be remitted to the territory under the Section 30 provisions. So while we may potentially have a windfall of as much as $148 million over the last 5 years, at the very least, there is a balance owed for all of those air transportation taxes that have been paid by the inhabitants over all those years, and there is a balance going forward that should be getting remitted to the territory under the Section 30 provisions. So this bill would require that the Department of Revenue and Taxation, in collaboration with the Guam International Airport Authority, determine the total air transportation taxes paid by inhabitants of Guam since the establishment of such tax, reconcile such information with the Section 30 reimbursements attributable to air transportation taxes, and report its findings for further action to Imagalayan Guahan and the Speaker of Legislature Guahan, not later than 180 days from the enactment of this act. Mr. Speaker, for Bill 64, similar to Bill 63, I have an amendment at the end of the last section there, which is the same language, adding, and thereafter the first business day in January of every calendar year for the preceding 12 months. That's an amendment similar to what was proffered on Bill 63.
Okay, on the amendment proffered by Senator Nicholas on January and thereafter. Anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Hearing no objection to the Senator San Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just passed out to all my colleagues a copy of letters that I've been looking for and asking for the department. It covers 4 bills. So on the amendment, I'm not debating his amendment. I just wanted to make sure my colleagues have a copy of the letters from the Department of Revenue and Tax in reference to the 4 bills, 24, 63, 64, and 65. I just want to make sure that's known, that of their non-support of those bills. Thank you.
That was read out by the Vice Speaker to us. On the amendment, anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? On the main motion.
I yield, Mr. Speaker, to any questions or comments.
Thank you. On the main motion. On the main motion, Bill 64-34. Any senator wish to be heard? On the main motion, Bill 64-34. Any senator wish to be heard? On the main motion. If not, Senator Nicholas, you're welcome to close. On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? Bill 65.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last bill in this series of bills is a little bit more elaborate than the first two. Bill 65-34, again, is seeking to make sure that we are fully reconciling all of our Section 30 monies that are due to us under the provisions of the Organic Act. This time, we are asking the Department of Revenue and Taxation to look closely at mortgage financing activities, banking, insurance, trust, and investment entities who do not file their taxes on Guam. Now, this one gets very interesting, Mr. Speaker, because the Organic Act says that any taxes derived from income derived from Guam should be remitted to the territory. Now, this is where it gets very interesting when you stop and think about it. If any of us open up our wallets, a lot of us, I'm assuming, will be able to pull out a credit card or two. Now, when you run your credit card, if you pay an annual fee, which you know, some credit cards still have annual fees, that's income derived from Guam. If you carry a balance on your credit card and you pay interest to the credit card company, that interest is interest income derived from Guam. And the income taxes payable to that annual fee and to that interest income is Section 30 income taxes that should be remitted to the territory. Because technically the credit card company that's making money off of this interest and making money off of this annual fee is paying its taxes to the IRS, but that tax was derived from Guam. It was derived also from the inhabitants of Guam. And so technically we do have a Section 30 claim based on the way it's written in the Organic Act for us to recover that interest, that tax on that interest income on those credit cards. It actually gets a lot more expansive than that, Mr. Speaker. Every time a house is bought here on Guam and it's bought on with a home loan, oftentimes the home loans are sold as mortgage-backed securities to a company like Freddie Mac, an agency like Freddie Mac. And Freddie Mac then packages all of these different home loans and sells them as mortgage-backed securities to investors. The income from the individuals paying their mortgage goes as a pass-through to interest income to those who are holding those mortgage-backed securities. That interest income and the tax generated from that interest income is derived from Guam because the mortgage is on Guam. The mortgage is being paid by an inhabitant of Guam. And so, therefore, the income from that mortgage-backed security traces all the way back to Guam. We should have a Section 30 claim on every tax that is paid, on every interest payment, and every pass-through payment on every single mortgage that is sold to the investment community. It gets even more broad, Mr. Speaker, because, for example, if you're working here on island and you have an online bank, or you trade online through, let's say, Ameritrade, and you buy and sell stocks on Ameritrade, and they're charging you a commission for every trade, that's income that's being derived from an inhabitant on Guam. That's income that's being paid to the IRS that we technically have a Section 30 claim on. As a matter of fact, if you look at your investment statement, if you have one of those off-island brokerage accounts, you'll even see that they withhold taxes. They withhold taxes on your dividends, they withhold taxes on your interest income, and even that withholding is Section 30 claim that is payable to Guam. If you have an online bank, if you use EverBank or any other online bank, and the bank is paying crediting interest to your account, and they're not sending you a tax form to indicate how much interest you owe, that's Section 30 claim that you can file. When you go and you swipe your credit card and use a merchant machine that isn't from a local institution, for example, if you go up, I think Kmart uses a merchant machine that is proprietary and that they have some kind of third-party provider. That third-party provider is charging a fee for every swipe. That fee is income being derived from Guam, but that provider is not a local financial institution. They're earning income off-island, paying taxes on that income, and that tax should be remitted back to the territory because that is derived on Guam. Another very interesting thing that was brought up to us by a firm here, a local firm, is that when you have, like let's say a 401k or an IRA, and you pay into it, and the money goes into the 401k pre-tax, as in they take the money off the top, and you don't pay taxes on that money. The company then invests that money, the account grows, and then when it's time to draw down from that, the way a 401k works is that you pay taxes when you take the money out. But if it's an off-island firm, they're withholding the taxes off-island, and they're sending that withholding to the IRS. But that withholding is actually being derived from income that was generated on Guam, paid by an inhabitant of Guam. That withholding is also a Section 30 claim. All of these are examples of how money is being made on this island, but the taxes are not being paid to this territory. Now, I'm not saying that these firms are not paying their taxes. I'm pretty certain they are. The thing is that they're paying it to the IRS. But the way the Organic Act is written and the way the Section 30 provision is written is that if it's derived on Guam, if it's paid by an inhabitant on Guam, then it should be covered into Guam. And so what we should be doing is what we are already, what we should be doing with these entities is what we are already doing with the military personnel, for example, making claim to Treasury, reconciling our amounts and saying, by the way, we need to know how much withholding was attributable to Guam, how much interest income was attributable to Guam, and how much of all that overall income tax is attributable to Guam. Mr. Speaker, these amounts technically can be reconciled going all the way back to whenever the Section 30 provisions were enforceable. If all of these taxes have been derived from inhabitants on Guam but not been getting covered into the Guam Treasury, but instead were being paid to IRS, we may have a significant amount owed to us by the federal government in the Section 30 provisions. So I humbly ask my colleagues to consider supporting Bill 65-34. Again, it's just another effort for us to be able to ensure that not only are we going to collect on what has been accruing, but that going forward we are also getting the rightful amount due. I do have a similar amendment for Bill 65 as I do with Bill 64 and 63. Mr. Speaker, on page 3, line 7 at the end of the section, adding the words, "and thereafter the first business day in January of every calendar year for the preceding 12 months.
On the amendment, Senator, on the amendment, anyone wish to be heard on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Seeing or hearing none.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Similar to previous amendments that were made to improve prior bills, on page 3, line 3, after the word such, add the word income, so it's very clear we're just asking for income information.
Is that clear to everybody? Where the word such appears, it should be followed by the word income. Any objection?
Mr. Speaker, just an inquiry. Where is this at? What line again?
Line 3, after the word such, add the word income.
You may continue.
On the amendment, Mr. Speaker?
On the amendment, anyone else wish to speak on it? Or any objection to the amendment?
And lastly, Mr. Speaker, again, to be consistent with prior amendments on similarly language legislation, page 3, line 3, after the word who, strike do not file taxes on Guam, and replace with file taxes in a jurisdiction other than Guam.
Is that amendment clear? Does anyone wish to speak on that amendment? Senator Torres.
I just want to note that that occurs in other places as well on page 2. Line 11 and line 21.
Okay, the clerk will take note of that. Thank you very much, Senator Torres. So the inclusion of those three. Any objection?
I yield to any questions or comments, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. On the main motion, Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, this is the one version of the three like bills that I find a little concerning because it's quite aggressive. And we had no input from the tax commissioner that is being referenced here as the responsible party. What I also am concerned about is, while I understand the intent, I also note that in many of the transactions that have to do with purchases, either online purchases or the like, Guam is not part of that drop-down menu component that would make it easier for people to ascertain if items are being procured from another jurisdiction or from Guam. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this measure is premature and that the route would be more feasible to work with the Department of Revenue and Taxation in setting up the framework for this type of an audit. Unlike the other two audits that were in reconciliations, that seemed to have a very direct source of information that one could glean, whereas this one I think is far-reaching and it's, in my opinion, a complicated bill. Many of us don't understand the nuances of the banking industry or the mortgage financing industry or insurance and trusts and the like. And I would offer that although we want to capture this information, that I think it's overreaching at this point, quite ambitious, and it's going to do a lot more than, it's going to actually frustrate people more than actually generating the results that we contemplate. So I have cautious support of this bill, and I also don't think that we have the mechanism in place to really achieve what we're aiming to achieve with this bill. But it is very well intended. Too smart for me, I'm afraid.
Never. Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Morrison? No? On the main motion? On you may close, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the retiring speaker. Actually, these three bills they're going to require work. But if we take just a closer look at the way the bill is written, we technically are not setting a strict parameter on the information that's going to be provided in these reports. Really what this bill does is it kind of just says get it started, get it going. Because the way it's written here is that the Director of Revenue Tax, in conjunction with the Insurance and Banking Commissioner, will determine the Guam source income generated by these businesses in mortgage financing, banking, insurance, trust, and investments who file taxes in a jurisdiction other than Guam and reconcile that income information. And then they report their findings for further action. We don't specify what is going to be in that report. We don't specify that it needs to be 100% exhaustive, but we do specify that a report needs to be provided. And this is done intentionally, Mr. Speaker, so that we can get the process going. And then we can begin guiding each other and having roundtables around these reports and then asking the questions not only between our own experts locally, but then engaging Treasury and saying, hey, you know, this is a report that we're pulling together. This is information that we're coming up with. We believe that this is money that we're owed. Is there anything else that we need to be doing in conjunction with you on the federal side for us to be able to start getting these payments in? So there's no penalty or no consequence necessarily this bill, but it does require for that information to begin getting compiled and for the report to start getting provided. So we can start having the conversations necessary to hopefully collect a lot more money in Section 30 than we have been, and potentially opening the door for large windfalls that I think all of us are hoping we will be able to get in order to help our fiscal situation. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. On the motion to send the bill down, any objection? Senator Lee, did you? No. Senator Tom Adams, 74-34.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to pass on file.
Bill 75-34.
Mr. Speaker, I move to pass on file.
77-34, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to place Bill 77-34 in the third reading file and be afforded an opportunity to speak on the measure.
Any objection? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to enact a cigarette stamp tax law on the territory. Now, just to be clear up front, we're not imposing a new tax. I'd like to thank the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication for helping to ensure the language was vetted to make sure that we're not going to be having any additional tax levied, because that is absolutely not the intent. The intent of this act is to put into place a process that's adopted in 47 other states. And the way this process works is if you're going to be selling cigarettes on Guam, you need to prepay the tax by acquiring a certain stamp. You prepay that tax, you put the stamp on the cigarette pack, and then you're able to sell the cigarettes. Now, to make it very simplistic, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of these stamps is similar to the little stickers that we put on our license plates for our vehicle registration. Now, when you put that little sticker on your license plate for a vehicle registration, you can spot real quickly, the police department, when enforcing the motor vehicle laws, can spot real quickly which registration is expired. The purpose of these tax stamps is so that the enforcement authority for our sin taxes, our cigarette taxes, is able to do the same. They're able to just look at a counter, look behind a bar, and see whether or not the taxes were paid for all of the products that are being sold. By doing that, by simplifying it to that extreme, we will be able to ensure that our tax collections on sin taxes for cigarettes are as robust as they can possibly be. You know, when you really think about it, if we did not have a requirement or a regulation that put those little stickers onto the license plates of cars, we will probably have a ton of unregistered vehicles on the road. Oftentimes, you walk out of your house and you randomly notice that your 2 stickers are different, and you remember, oh my gosh, my wife, she was able to get her registration done, and I neglected to do so. These kind of very quick spot checks to be able to determine if we are in compliance is very, very handy for us to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so when it comes to our cigarette taxes, we want to make sure we're collecting those as robustly as possible, because those taxes are supposed to go to our Healthy Futures Fund. And they go and they pay for all kinds of things, from our entitlement programs that help keep our medical system running to even money that goes into the Guam Memorial Hospital. And so if we want to make sure that we're bringing in every single dollar, we need to make sure that we're simplifying the enforcement process as much as possible. And by having these stamps on the cigarettes, the same way 47 other states do, we're going to be able to make sure that those taxes are being paid and the coffers are as full as possible with respect to the tax. The bill includes timelines for implementation. Upon enactment of the Act, Revenue Tax has 90 days to be able to go out and determine how they're going to implement this program. Because it's in 47 other states, there's a lot of case studies and examples out there. There's a lot of established companies that do this. We just want to make sure that we're giving the agency enough time to be able to go out and determine the plan of action. After that 90 days has lapsed and the plan is completed and presented as mandated, then the entire industry on Guam will have a full year, inclusive of those 90 days, a full year to implement this program. So we're not requiring stamps to be put on tomorrow. We're not forcing the agencies to come up with a plan, fast. I'd like to thank again the committee for having the roundtable necessary for us to get the feedback to come up with a timeline that is implementable. 1 year based on the stamp manufacturers, 1 year is more or less the average that was necessary for jurisdictions to be able to implement this program. And since it's so commonplace, I'm hopeful that we can do so within a similar time frame. One other advantage of having these stamps, Mr. Speaker, is not just in the collection of the tax, but in the enforcement of our smoking laws. If a parent finds a pack of cigarettes in their child's backpack, you can track that pack by going through the stamp. It will no longer be an issue of some unscrupulous cigarette seller selling tobacco to minors and thinking they can just get away with it because they can deny it. You sell that pack has a stamp, it gets in the hands of a minor, someone's going to be accountable. And that's in line with the measures that we've passed in this body to try and reduce the underage smoking here on the island. The stamps are in line with the intentions of us to try and bring in as much tobacco revenue as possible to help offset the health challenges that we have in this community. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is in 47 other states. We've had a roundtable with the agencies. We've had a lot of discussion on it. And I think that the implementation of this program's time has come, and I think that it will be good for our community, not only from a financial perspective, but also from an enforcement and social ills perspective. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Senator San Agustin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say that I understand where Senator Nicholas is coming from when it deals in stamps, but I want to make it very clear with my colleagues that at the Department of Revenue and Tax, or there is a law that deals with stamps when it deals with liquor. And it's not paid for, it's not provided by the department, but provided by the wholesaler to make sure that every retail liquor that is sold is properly marked. There's a government warning. Now, if there is a requirement for a stamp on a pack of cigarettes, that should be provided by the wholesaler themselves, because under the business and privilege tax section, they go out to the wholesalers and they count the number of cigarettes, cartons, cases, and they control they know what's coming out of the bonded area. So if they're required to provide a stamp at the cigarettes, based on that inventory or the product going out, we would know the count. The department knows the count today. So if we're worried about the taxes, I think that those are met already. But for the stamp purpose, I would actually be more supportive if we require the wholesalers to provide it, and that when the compliance officers go out to inspect the stores or any of the businesses that are licensed to sell cigarettes, they'll know if the proper stamp has been placed on. And if it hasn't, then they have the authority to confiscate it, and they don't need to wait no 7 days. They can do it right on the spot, and they can levy the fines that need to be levied. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion, Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I would just like to follow up on that last question or comment and inquire of the sponsors. So who puts the stamps on? And my reading of this was it's going to be the wholesalers or the distributors. If the sponsor would yield. Is that correct?
Do you used to yield?
On the section 6704, we do have wholesaler and retailer requirements. We don't specify necessarily a single entity that's responsible for putting the stamp on. We are requiring that the stamp be put on. So the product is going to be sold, it has to be stamped.
Does it have to be stamped when it's sold to a retailer from a wholesaler?
Senator.
On page 7, section 6704, wholesaler and retailer requirements. All wholesalers or distributors are required to pay the appropriate tax for each cigarette in its inventory, except as provided under 11 GCA section 26601C for inventory held in a warehouse under bond. Even though wholesalers are required to affix the stamps to cigarette packages prior to shipping to retail outlets, every cigarette retailer is responsible for inspecting their shipments upon receipt to ensure cigarette stamps have been properly affixed. Unstamped cigarette packages should be removed from inventory and set aside for return to the cigarette supplier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's what I'm reading too. So it looks to me like the wholesalers are the ones responsible for putting these stamps on. Okay. The bill, I mean, when we first had the hearing on the bill, there were several concerns brought up by different companies, and I was concerned that of the several companies that sell or wholesale cigarettes, they weren't all in agreement as to this bill. And it looks to me like they still are not all in agreement with this bill. And I guess I just want to, I just hope, I mean, the bill by itself, it looks good to me. The problem with it is that it has costs that are, according to these companies, very prohibitive, and they had suggested different ways to implement this that would be less costly to those companies. But they had also suggested something at the hearing that I was very concerned about, and that was that the customs inspection, they said, should have been the mechanism in place that would catch all these cigarettes that are imported and that might have prevented the problem of the black market of cigarettes that they described, or the untaxed cigarettes or unreported cigarettes that are being sold. And so I am still concerned that, while this bill will require a stamp on all the taxes, it's going to require these companies to pay for the machines and implement this, but that we may not be solving the problem that was pointed out, that where this originated is that what we're supposed to be inspecting at our borders when they come in is not being done. And so I'm still concerned about that, Mr. Speaker, and the bill does not address that. But it does address stamps. And may I ask, if the sponsor would yield again, Mr. Speaker, to one more question. On page 20, it says the funding, so that we're appropriating $200,000 from the Healthy Future Fund's revenues to the Attorney General for enforcement. Wait. Yeah. Never mind, Mr. Speaker. That's not the question. My question is just to make it very clear. It's the companies that initially put this stamp on that are going to incur the cost of the machines for the stamp according to the regulations that are going to be promulgated in 90 days by the Department of Revenue Tax. And so before we have the regulations, we really don't know exactly what type of machines Department of Revenue Tax is going to require. And, but the companies, the wholesale companies will have a year to acquire that type of machinery. Is that correct? All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other, did you wish to add, Senator San Agustin?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to add to the last speaker. On that page 20, the sum of $200,000 to Attorney General's office. During my time at Revenue and Tax, I never saw the Attorney General's office enforcing cigarette sales or alcohol sales. So if they want to give money to somebody to enforce it, it's Revenue and Tax. The compliance branch is the one that enforces that, and Public Health. They're the only two offices that does that. The agencies have never gone out there and done any inspections.
Thank you. Any other comments on the bill? On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? If not, Senator Nicholas, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I humbly ask my colleagues to support this. It will very much streamline the enforcement of our tax assessments with respect to cigarettes. From what we've seen, Mr. Speaker, just the introduction of this bill has resulted in a bump in some of the cigarette tax collections. Knowing that this law is potentially coming through this body, you're starting to see entities pay more. You know, one of the facts that we were able to glean was in an analysis of the market share of one of the wholesalers on the island. In analyzing their market share with respect to the amount of taxes that they were paying, it was estimated that if the overall market share was fully paying its taxes, we would be bringing in between $12 and $13 million more every single year in taxes. So by simplifying the enforcement and by creating this mandate that is in 47 other states, creating it here, I think would go a long way towards bringing in much needed revenue for us to be able to continue to meet the needs of this community by just making sure that everybody's paying the taxes they're supposed to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? Hearing none. I note the hour is now 5:30. Why don't we take a recess until 9 tomorrow morning? Thank you very much.